What's up, everyone? I managed to squeeze in another interview for the pod this week. This one has been in the works for some time following my conversation with Sean Kelly from the California Institute of Integral Studies back in September. If you haven't listened to that conversation yet, you might want to go back to the references and links for a quick summary glance of that interview, or listen to the conversation first. That said, this episode is incredibly special for me since my dad and William White attended Goddard College, where Francis has been a faculty member since the early 2000s. So though I've never attended Goddard College, I nevertheless feel like Goddard's motto and educational philosophy permeates my whole being. Like usual, I hope you all enjoy the conversation, and make sure to check out the links and references. And if time permits, check out my new Substack page called Integral Humanitas, which is a sort of behind-the-scene commentary, some of my thoughts for starting my podcast, along with a few other subjects close and dear to my heart. Cheers, and I hope you're all doing well. Bonjour, Francis.
Bonjour, Eric.
I almost feel that maybe we should do this in French at one point or another as well.
Well, let's see about that.
I'm super excited to talk to you, obviously. After talking to Sean and Sean pointing me in your direction, and then, having a quick conversation. Well, it wasn't really a quick conversation. We actually had quite a long conversation. And you pointing me in the direction of all kinds of resources and ideas. I just, I'm super grateful and happy that we connected. And I'm also a bit disappointed, actually, that since you've been in my backyard for so long, that we haven't connected sooner. So hopefully we're making up for lost time along that. For people that are listening in, people might, I encourage people to go back and listen to my conversation with Sean Kelly. Sean Kelly essentially pointed me in Francis's direction since he's up in Montreal, and he's been involved on multiple fronts in the field of religious studies and consciousness studies for a number of years. And been involved with Goddard as well, Goddard College. So I'm excited to go and talk to you about all of that, obviously, Francis. So I guess maybe we could start off. Maybe you could talk a bit about how you got started in the field of religious studies, and that eventually led up to you connecting with Sean.
Well, I think it really grew out of an interest that, stems all the way back into my early life, frankly, into my childhood. I was raised within the Roman Catholic tradition, pre-Vatican II, and I did not have, as actually many people have had, a negative experience being raised within that tradition. It was more or less living within a world, a rather complete world, full of rituals, symbols, tradition, one thing or another. It had its downsides looking back many years later in terms of limitations and more or less being consigned to a particular community of people and what have you. But on the other hand, there are upsides to that. In the course of time, I underwent the sort of changes that many people do. And in my particular experience, I came through the 60s and into the 70s. And of course, this is the period of the whole countercultural upheaval, some people call it a revolution, in which the world sort of expanded, and it expanded as a result of an interest in different states of consciousness, some of which had to do with artificially stimulated states of consciousness, which I have to say I did not myself really get all that involved in. But I became interested in some of the material that was surfacing related to Eastern religious traditions of one sort or another. The work of Alan Watts and the movements that came out of India with a number of different gurus of one sort or another, and an interest in trying to get to the sources of some of these traditions. And so I actually had a good friend of mine, Jean Nattel, and I, who shared this interest. And we used to go down to New York and go to Orientalia, which was a bookstore there, and another one called Samuel Weiser's, which sort of both of which ceased to exist, or at least Weiser's, I think, resurfaced in Massachusetts or somewhere down in Maine. But reading that material and interacting with people who also engaged in a number of these traditions got me very interested in religious studies as a more formal way of approaching this. I think I had a kind of penchant or inclination toward the kind of academic orientation and understanding, even though that was not formalized or developed. And then I had the opportunity really to explore a number of these traditions in a real-time way. And I went to India, and I spent time in an ashram in India, wandering around, seeing all kinds of fascinating sites, visiting centers. I traveled from India across through Central Asia, was exposed to Islam, Islamic sites, Sufi shrines of one sort or another. And I ended up in Israel after a very long, protracted trip. And I stayed there for a number of months and again had an opportunity to visit sites and to connect with people. And I think that had a strong impact because it was a very concrete kind of physical experience to see places like Benares and Jerusalem, and I went to Europe as well. And when I got back, I decided that I should find a way of pursuing this more formally. And I actually enrolled in a CEGEP, in a very interesting program there called the New School Program under an odd fellow whose name was Gary Maletzer. And I had a great time and more or less was able to do what I wanted. And in a short period of time, I graduated and I had to make a decision. And I had three options. One was to go into psychology because I was interested in psychology, but a particular form of psychology, which frankly, in looking at psych departments, I did not really see reflected there. And by that, I mean, I was interested in Jung and kind of the depth psychological traditions and what was emerging to become later on transpersonal psychology. And then I was interested in anthropology because I had a professor who had done field work, came from actually Columbia, Margaret Mead and that whole group. And he had done field work in Africa and introduced me and other students to these different cultures, which were also fascinating. I went into the Department of Religious Studies at McGill and had a conversation with some people there. And they offered me money and an opportunity to go into religious studies. And I decided to take that route. And I did an undergraduate degree in religious studies in what we might generally call comparative religion or history of religions. And I was exposed to Islam in a more formal way as well. Took a magnificent course with Charles Adams, who was the director of the Islamic Institute. At that point, McGill had one of the few institutes there. And I was one of the few Westerners in a class of Muslims who had come to the Islamic Institute. And sitting beside me was
and for people that don't know about that institute, I mean, maybe we should just say that Wilfred Cantwell Smith founded that institute prior to, I mean, you formally going there. But so he was already gone at that point, or he was still there during?
No, Cantwell Smith had gone off to Harvard to become the director for the Center for the Study of Religion. And then he went to Dalhousie afterwards and set up a program in religious studies there too.
Yeah. Excellent.
Uh, it was Charles Adams was the director at the time that I was there and gave this now legendary course in Islam. And I was going to say the person beside me was the hereditary successor of a Sufi brotherhood who knew the Quran by heart in Arabic. So I was distinctly intimidated.
But in very good company, though.
In very good company and way out of my depth. But it was a memorable experience, and I enjoyed that too. But I took an interest, I think, in two areas in particular initially, and that was Christianity and Hinduism. And I spent a lot of time studying Hinduism with a number of people there. And then I did a master's and shifted out of so-called comparative religion and focused on psychology of religion. And I actually wrote my master's thesis on Carl Jung. And I couldn't go any further because they didn't have the resources. And I ended up going to University of Ottawa, where there was an individual who had come out of Yale who kind of represented the psych of religion sort of area, Naomi Goldenberg, and I applied and was accepted to do my doctorate there. And that's where I met Sean Kelly, because Sean did his doctorate there at roughly the same time as I did. And we, of course, became friends and had common interests in Jung and so on and so forth. He wrote his dissertation on Jung and Hegel, and I wrote my dissertation on the influence of spiritualism on Jung. And so we shared a lot of things in common, and subsequently went off in our different directions. He to California, and eventually I ended up at Goddard College in Vermont. So that's kind of the rough itinerary, as it were.
And I love that story. I mean, because both institutions, the California Institute of Integral Studies and Goddard, I've known people that have been involved with those two universities that have had just a tremendous impact on me. Like I shared with you, obviously, my dad went to Goddard, and another person that really influenced me from Goddard is William White, who went there and did his work in terms of the field of addiction studies and recovery specifically. And then obviously somebody that was involved from another person that was heavily involved in the area of Montreal that was, I guess, corresponded and did kind of was involved, I guess, somewhat on your level with the California Institute of Integral Studies was Albert Lowe, who, had obviously had a tremendous impact on me as well. And so, and he was the reason why I eventually went back to university and ended up in the religious studies department up at Concordia. But through the conversation that I had with Sean, I mean, obviously I discovered Sean's work in the late 1990s and got introduced to Ken Wilber. So that's been a bit of a common thread through all of the conversations I've been having on the podcast. So to connect with you now and get this other sort of version of this history has just been so tremendous for me. And so I've just been so excited. I mean, particularly the work of Howard Coward that you referred me to. I've been reading that I've been reeling since I've kind of started reading his work because of, when I expressed to you essentially is that I'm very interested in the history of religious studies and some of the differences, I guess, in terms of in Canada and in the United States. And what I'm so happy about that I connected with you and Sean is that you guys kind of you guys lived on both sides of the borders of this story. And that's really what I want to go out and explore with you a bit more actually now as well, is that, I mean, from McGill and then to Ottawa and then to Goddard. I mean, because Goddard has a specific motto and philosophy of education that I'd like to hear you talk a bit about more, on the podcast and for other people to go and hear, because it's something that's had a tremendous impact on me as well. Essentially is the motto of knowing, being, and doing, and how much that's come to influence you in terms of your view of what religious studies could be, and not only what it could be, but also, to the discipline now of consciousness studies. So I was wondering maybe if you could talk a bit about that in terms of how you got involved in all of that.
I was hired at Goddard College in the late 90s to develop the consciousness studies concentration, which it was a graduate concentration and a degree track in what eventually became the Graduate Institute at Goddard. And they were looking for somebody that had that mixed background, that didn't sit easily in faculty or departments of religion or religious studies in Canada, the experience that both Sean Kelly and I had, which is, I think, one of the reasons why we don't see in Canada, for the most part, anything along the lines of what we see at CIIS or even the Consciousness Studies concentration at Goddard or other institutions. There was not the same level of receptivity and interest. There was actually a suspicion around anything like that. It was too exotic, far out, it sat outside of academia, and so on. Goddard's orientation is really influenced by a different pedagogical perspective that's rooted in John Dewey's conception of what education consists of, and became embodied in Goddard in particular through really its inspired director, whose name was Tim Pitkin. And what he wanted to do was to take Dewey's ideas and to develop an institution of progressive education that was very inclusive and whose orientation was really to find within the students themselves the motivation that would fuel their work, energize them, and so on. And to develop what we call a kind of an integrated model of education. And that consists of just the knowing being doing. So the acquisition of knowledge, which is a kind of a formal process in which you explore different subject matter, etc., without the defined, distinct disciplinary boundaries that are often found in other programs and other institutions. And then the being part is really to ask the question of the extent to which the individual is connected to their work, related to their work, with a certain affirmation and validation of that, and the need to really bring this into relief, which is, again, different from what we see at other institutions where one wants to claim some kind of level of objectivity, and that means that you want to exclude the subjective as much as possible. The I shouldn't be in your writing. It should be the divine we or us or something along those lines. Like Goddard, the perspective is the opposite of that. You should find yourself at the center of your work. Whoever connects to your work should see that reflected there. And lastly, the doing part, which is to take this acquisition of knowledge, your own presence in your work, the growth that occurs as a result of that, and to seek what relevance it might have for the larger world, be that a particular community that you might be connected with, or even the larger, more idealistic realm of the world itself. And that you should seek validation out there too. So it's not just a personal subjective process. It really is a process that is intended to serve the world too. Dewey had this conception, sounds a little old-fashioned now, but it still, I think, could be seen to address this. And Dewey said that education, the purpose of education, the end of education is to develop the opportunity to create citizens to take their place in a democratic society. So this is his sort of idea or vision of that. And in a way that kind of is present in this model, which crosses all the programs at Goddard, of which there are a number. There's interdisciplinary arts, there's a writing program, a psych program, a liberal arts program, as it were. But they all share this pedagogical orientation that's usually designated as progressive education, etc. Now, And so when I landed there, this was really something new that I had not directly experienced, and it was an adjustment to move from dispensing and dispersing knowledge to students who would then regurgitate back to you, and you would assess it in exams or final products or something along those lines. You actually work with students, and we call ourselves at Goddard advisors rather than professors, et cetera, et cetera. We are there to share the journey students take in the acquisition of knowledge, connecting themselves to it and bringing it into the world, and offer them feedback, direct them to sources, help them think through what it is that they're doing, and to try and identify the uniqueness of their input in this whole process, so that the end result is not just to find a replication of yourself there as an advisor, but really to bring out the best in the students' work. And so that was a different orientation and required a great deal of patience, discernment, and a more expansive kind of perspective on what constitutes learning and personal development, so on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it's not that. I mean, it was in the air as well, I guess, in Montreal, because, like you said, I mean, you went to the new school up at Dawson, so this idea of
Yeah.
experiential learning was, I mean, is very much present. I mean, I'm a graduate of Concordia in the, well, now the applied human science, but at the time was the applied social science, and that they were weaving in a lot of these ideas and stuff like that. And in fact, I mean, some of the the people that were involved with the YMCA where I grew up and were also involved up at Concordia and stuff like that. I mean, that's, actually how my dad, got involved eventually and landed up at Goddard himself. He had two options. Essentially, he could go to Springfield College, which is basically the Y school, I guess, in the US. But Goddard was another one that was bouncing around that eventually he latched onto, and he ended up going there. But he felt kind of like you as well, sort of a bit of a fish out of water, being from Montreal. And being a bit shell shocked, I mean, because of everything that was going on in the U.S. during that time as well, and in the the late '60s, early '70s into the '80s and stuff like that. But I guess because I mean, this is I guess is interesting to me too, is that I mean Goddard now, I mean Goddard is a very long-standing university and institution compared to even something like CIIS or the California Institute of Integral Studies, and you guys are still standing, and yet there's been pop-ups of institutes and alternative colleges and other experiments like this across the United States that haven't really sort of lasted the test of time. And I'm wondering now, that you've had this experience with that type of program, if you think maybe that's why Canadians were reluctant to go as far, maybe, or to push the envelope in terms of progressive education, like some of these institutions in the US, that hasn't gone out and replicated in Canada. I'm kind of curious to hear, your thoughts on why, or maybe, that's something that might happen eventually here as well, or just, just to hear a couple of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think you're right that there are similar experiments in education that we could identify in this country. There's a place out in BC and a couple of other places. But I think in the United States, this sort of, desire to generate different perspectives, risk around this stuff, I think is also characteristic of the U.S. too. And I'd say that that's one of the cultural differences. And at the same time, I also think what you put your finger on, and I experienced that in Goddard in the over 20 years I was there, and the precariousness and the fragility of institutions that are only of a certain size with a certain sort of financial endowment. Hampshire College is another one that nearly closed, that struggled to stay on its feet, which was very similar to Goddard. There are a number of other places that have simply shut down. And Goddard, even now, leads a precarious existence. that is very much dependent on students getting various forms of grants to be able to pay their tuition. And Goddard is largely running on the tuition that students pay. I think, there was something like 90 something percent, as I recall, of students who, lived on these various forms of grants that are available in the United States, and many of them having jobs. And it's also the case in the United States, public support for education, as we know, is really prescribed and very limited. And Goddard is near the bottom in terms of the costs of going to that institution, but it still leads a precarious existence. And that can be uninviting to students, even idealistic students, because they're not sure of what the outcome is going to be and whether the degrees are going to have, any kind of integrity to them, and so on and so forth. And we have actually seen that more, I'd say, in the last decade in the US. And places have merged, and I could go on for a long time about this, because I was the chair of the faculty council at Goddard twice. I sat on the president's council. I was on the board of trustees. I wore so many hats down there that really made me aware of the struggles of an institution like Goddard to just support and sustain itself. It's fragile. And it very much is dependent on the people that are involved to support and sustain itself. It doesn't have the kind of base that can weather stormy times, such as the times we're going through, and the political polarization and all the rest of the stuff, which has had an impact on higher education in the US.
No, for sure. Yeah. And I mean, because that's something that obviously I'm witnessing. And I mean, it came up as well a bit in the conversation that I had with Sean, where Sean mentioned that, that CIS is still standing, but I mean, as an institution, it's young, but compared to Goddard, I mean, Goddard's been around for over 100 years, if I understand correctly.
I think in the 1930s, it was sort of,
yeah.
Really emerged. Yeah.
But, I guess in terms of, since you guys both studied in religious studies and you're both interested in the psychology of religion, I was wondering what was maybe in the air that made you guys latch on to Jung at that particular moment in time. And, and it's really, I mean, it's inspired most of your work. And I mean, it's still very much, the work that you've even think about, if I look at some of your publications online and obviously your book, I mean, you've spent your whole life studying Jung and religious studies. I was wondering what drew you, or what was it about Jung that, made you kind of dive in those so deep?
I think it was the examination of the psychological dimension that Jung brought into a relationship with the broad field of religion, what we would call religious studies, but that there is a spiritual kind of dimension that Jung affirms in his psychological model, and offers at the same time a means by which to make intelligible and to grant a level of meaning to what constitutes the fundamental sort of principles of religion, religious traditions, including the Western religious tradition. And that was also born, I think, out of Jung's own personal experience, being the son of a Swiss pastor and having a number of uncles who were as well, and experienced the meaninglessness, the growing meaninglessness of that tradition in his own life, that he then drew away from and went into science, was terribly dissatisfied with that, and found a way back into trying to reconcile or bring the two together. That is to say, his own medical field and psychiatry, and then the whole area of spirituality, which in Jung's case also exists outside of formal religious traditions, especially his later work in alchemy and so on and so forth. And that was, I think, tremendously exciting for a whole number of us, actually, there were a few of us who went into this. And I think one of the difficulties for anyone who is interested in exploring, Jung in that perspective is the range of Jung's learning and what he brings to bear on all of this stuff. And that takes a great deal of work to sort of get a kind of sufficient enough grasp to be able to put together any kind of study or advanced knowledge in the area and make a contribution and that kind of stuff. And so you're drawn further and further in as you try to get a greater and greater understanding till you're, completely immersed in it, and just to the degree to which other things become peripheral to it in a way. At the same time, it offers you a window on any number of traditions, including Eastern traditions too, that Jung wrote to some degree on: Zen Buddhism, Introduction to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, I Ching, and a whole series of other things.
Which he popularized in a certain way. I mean, along with Alan Watts, I mean, he drew a lot of people to those particular works.
Yeah, and interacted and connected with people who were working on this material that he then brought to the Jung Institute in Zurich, Switzerland, and the other institutes, across especially the Western world, did the same too. So they became centers in which the kind of interest that had surfaced had a forum to be presented, discussed, understood, and potentially integrated into, a psychological model in Western culture. I think that was the attraction for, I think, and I'm speaking largely for myself here, but I think, for Sean, it was something similar too. And then it can be a jumping off point for other things, such as going into areas of transpersonal psychology. Some people went off into Wilbur. Others, Stanislav Grof, for example, would be, I think, current sort of individual who has taken a lot of Jung's ideas and extended through his studies of psychoactives and so on.
Gotcha. And well, I mean, because Jung is still very much alive. I mean, Jordan Peterson is one very kind of popular and kind of person that's out there that's talked quite a bit about Jung recently. And I mean, recently as well, I mean, I've had the opportunity to go out and meet Sean McGrath from McGill and from Memorial and I got introduced to his work through a friend, but he also did a recent podcast series on Christianity and Jung, which was fascinating in terms of an overall sort of theme and subject. And they explored, I mean, not only Jung, but they also explore, Schelling and German idealism, and the work of Slavoj Zizek as well, who's quite popular with a number of people. So, I mean, he's still very much in the air. And I mean, this is the reason why I was pretty excited to go and talk to you as well, and to Sean, is because, I mean, you guys have been surfing this wave for so long, just as much like kind of like Harold Coward, in terms of the book that you recommended to me in terms of his 50 years of religious studies in Canada. And obviously I'm still reeling, having read that and thinking about my own personal studies, and now coming off this conversation with Sean McGrath and stuff like that. So I was like, well, I would love to hear, and it'd be fun, I think, maybe even for the audience to listen a bit to, how you kind of got introduced to Harold Coward, and how that eventually led to the publication of your book as well. I'd love to hear that story again, if you share it again there as well with the audience.
Yeah, I actually didn't know who he was when I was doing my doctorate at the University of Ottawa, and there was a conference at Laval University, and I decided to submit a proposal for a piece of work I was interested in, and that was the interaction, the correspondence, the exchange between Carl Jung and a Dominican priest whose name was Victor White. And the correspondence has subsequently been published. In those days, it was not, except for what was found within the 2 volumes of Jung's correspondence where there were large footnotes, long footnotes that quoted some of White's works, and White had written a number of essays and so on and so forth. So there was enough material to put together a presentation. So I gave that presentation, and Coward was in the audience, and he came up to me afterwards and he said, "Oh, I thought this was really good. You should really submit it for publication," and so on. I subsequently did, and it was published by the Journal of Analytical Psychology, which was the premier Jungian journal in the UK. And he asked me what else I was doing. I said I was doing my doctorate on certain influences on Jung. And he asked me about it, and I told him more or less what I was doing. And we had a conversation, and he handed me his card, and on the back of it, he wrote somebody's name, and this was the editor of SUNY Press. He said, "When you finish it, send it to him and mention that I had encouraged you to do so." Okay. And that was kind of the end of our conversation. And Elizabeth Lascelles, who was the chair of the department at the University of Ottawa at one point, came up to me and said, "Coward came up to me and said this and that about your work, and and she was all kind of excited about that. And frankly, I didn't even know who he was. So he was, this important person who was well known, and on and on and on. And long and short of it is, when I finished writing up my PhD, I sent it off. And it was some months, and I just assumed that it would, it ended up on somebody's desk and then maybe in the garbage can, who knows. The next thing, I get this registered package, and it's a contract with SUNY Press to publish the book, which I was very surprised at. And the rest is, as it were, kind of history. I went through the whole process of having it published with copy editors, one or another. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, so after that, I guess did you stay on top, or you kind of started to follow Coward's work from there on? That's how you ended up suggesting the book to me? Because I was really surprised how you not suggested it. I mean, you suggested it to me because it's a very recent publication, and I was quite surprised about that. And
but the work of Coward that I was familiar with, in the course of time, had more to do with Coward's work on Jung and Eastern religion. Okay. So he had published this work on Jung and Eastern religion, and that, in some respects, is still a very solid piece of work. And this grew out of Coward, who did his doctorate at McMaster's University. He came out of a Christian background in one thing or another, but his area of specialization was really in Hinduism and Indian studies. He studied under Murthy there, who's a well-known scholar, and others, and had published in that field. And I got to know more about that, but I was particularly interested in his work on Jung and Indian thought. And he subsequently published another work. And then, of course, he edited a whole series of works that grew out of conferences of one sort or another. He ended up at the University of Calgary and then went on to University of Victoria. I really did not stay in touch with him. I bumped into him, once or twice at conferences. We had a brief exchange and so on. But he was really the one that was instrumental in me getting, this book published. I don't know what I would have done, probably not sent it off, or, any number of other things with it, broken it up into a couple of articles. But that first one on White and Jung was accepted. That was my first publication, and I was actually a little surprised. But and every submission that I have made to journals and this and that and the next thing have been published. So I managed to get a little bit of the fairy dust, I said at the beginning, and it's been helpful since then. and not extensive, but I've done a number of things. And
Yeah.
along the lines of Jung, I would just like to rewind back to what you raised before, which is that there is this ongoing interest in Jung. I think this is also in part because the publication of Jung's work is ongoing. There's,
Mhm.
the so-called collected works of Jung in German and in English, and there's French editions, what have you. But the Red Book of Jung, which was published in 2009, which was really this personal, illuminated manuscript that constituted Jung's own breakthrough into the deeper regions of the unconscious, which surfaced all kinds of fascinating material and was known about but never saw the light of day other than a few items that were drawn from it by his secretary, ended up in a long protracted negotiation with his family that had authority over Jung's works to be published in 2009. And that was
Mm.
something of a sensation and attracted people. The New York Magazine published a piece on it. There was a big deal at the Rubin Museum in New York where it was exhibited, and on and on and on. And also, many of Jung's seminars started to be published, and a foundation was created called the Philemon Foundation. And there are several volumes that have now come out from Jung's seminars that he gave, which have attracted a lot of attention and interest on the part of not only people who are followers of Jung, students of Jung, but people who are interested in this kind of material, much of which is really remarkably current, even for the fact that it was presented in seminars going back, decades and decades and decades ago. Jung died in 1961. It's really, surprising the extent to which he was, he anticipated so many shifts and changes, and I think that's one of the attractions. So just to say that the publication of his works are ongoing still.
Ongoing.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, okay. Well, that makes a lot of sense too, then, in terms of why there's so much excitement still out in the culture as well.
Yeah.
But I mean, the other thing too that's interesting about Coward is that, I mean, he studied with George Grant up at McManus. Uh, and I mean, like, just reading some of the dates as well. I mean, McMaster's was 65. It was founded in terms of the religious studies department. McGill was 1970. Concordia was 1972. Ottawa was 65. Université de Montréal, Université du Québec à Montréal was in 69. So, I mean, even religious studies in Canada is a very new and fresh thing. I'm curious to hear a bit, maybe your thoughts about, how George Grant and the impact he had as well, maybe on the field of religious studies in Canada, and how you think maybe that contrasts or is different maybe from in the US, or if you have any
Yeah.
thoughts on that specifically.
Yeah, and I recommended another work to you as well, which was on the history of religious studies in Canada, and I think identified there, and part of my own experience as well, is that many faculties of theology or faculties of divinity were the place in which you did pursue what were areas that later on constituted religious studies. So even though these were formally founded as separate entities from confessionally oriented faculties of divinity and so on, there was a transition into this stuff. It didn't just happen at the dates of the founding.
Exactly.
There was, there was a lot of this going on in one way, shape, or form for some years, and not only in faculties of divinity, but also in East Asian studies, in South Asian studies, and even the Islamic Institute, people who were interested in Near Eastern studies. Religious studies, in a way, tried to draw on these other fields in as far as they were focusing in areas that constituted religious studies and bring them into this form that were, it was called departments of religion, departments of religious studies. There are various names here for it. So this was a process. And in Canada, I think it's very much the case that this was an evolution. when I was at McGill, even though it was a faculty of religious studies, I remember Klaus Klaustemeyer, who was really one of the great scholars of Hinduism internationally. He was teaching out in Manitoba at the time. And we fell into a conversation because I was interested in India, and I actually had a friend who had studied with him and one thing or another. And he still thought McGill was more a faculty of theology than religious studies, even though it was called the
Interesting.
Faculty of Religious Studies, simply because the majority of the faculty at that time and the different courses that were offered and who was running what, etc., were really all part and parcel of the different theological colleges that coexisted with Goddard. And there was less of a kind of religious studies as a independent kind of entity. And I would say not only that, even Cantwell Smith, who really represents one of the approaches to the whole area of religious studies, was off at Harvard, and they created the Center for the Study of World Religion, which McGill had a connection with. But the kind of honeypot of history of religions was at the University of Chicago with Iliad and all of that group that was much more influenced by Eastern traditions of one sort or another, which was really the background of Iliad, who ended up becoming chair of the department out there. And that developed into a different kind of orientation and was less attached to or influenced by a theological perspective. And that became part of the debate, I think, that we see, not only in Canada, but in the States. Certainly in Canada, at the University of Toronto, is religious studies an independent kind of approach that's largely identifiable with the social sciences, rather than influenced by a theological perspective. And, there's been a struggle around this kind of stuff. And I'd say much more in Canada than I saw, at least in my experience in the United States. And then you have these sort of maverick programs, such as CIIS or, any number of others. Goddard never had a religious studies program per se.
Yes, true, yeah.
But they had people down there. Well, the first time I heard about Goddard was from Paul Reps. Paul Reps was this fascinating individual who was an American military fellow who served out in Asia and became drawn to Buddhism, Zen Buddhism in particular, and wrote a very now classic book called Zen Flesh, Zen Bones. I met him at Concordia University, where he was giving a lecture, and I was introduced to him through a friend of mine who had an interest in Buddhism. And I had said, "Oh, well, where have you been?" He said, "I've been to a place called Goddard College." And so that was the first time, frankly, I had heard about Goddard.
You've heard it. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. But when I was hired at Goddard, in the library, you had all of this material, which was the older material connected to Indian philosophy, Buddhism, and all kinds of, it's clear that there were people who had an interest in this stuff, and that was reflected in the stacks of the library, even if they didn't formally have a religious studies program, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And I mean, John Dewey as well, in terms of his, well, obviously as a, one of the founders, I guess you could say, of pragmatism, along with William James. I mean, there's a deep influence of kind of idealism or Hegelianism in their work as well, in terms of their thinking, which is pretty interesting as well. And how in Canada we also have our own sort of kind of Canadian idealism tradition, which is slightly different than down in the United States and stuff like that. And that's something that I've been thinking about quite a bit, I guess, throughout all the conversations that I've been having and stuff like that, and trying to figure out. I mean, it's even a question that I posed to Sean, is that Sean Kelly specifically, whether Charles Taylor and his work in terms of on Hegel at the time, if it had any particular impact on him and stuff like that. I was wondering if Charles Taylor at all maybe had an impact on you as well, in terms of some of your thinking, since you've been bouncing around the religious studies, George Grant being one, Cantwell Smith being another one. I mean, Taylor kind of is around the superficial kind of field as well, I guess you could say, along with philosophy of religion.
Right. I think more recently, some of his work is quite. He did a piece on William James and other things on secularism and religion. I think the work that I took an interest in was sources of the self. I was
Mm.
interested in the emergence of what constituted this sense of identity within Western culture, and I was interested in that in relation to sort of modern psychology, even though Taylor's construction around this stuff grew out of, some of the intellectual traditions, Montesquieu and a whole series of others in Europe at the time. And the whole question, which, the postmodernists get into, is whether, identity is constructed, whether rather than a kind of a given. And what this had to do with Jung's notion of the self, which is really a central piece of Jung's own psychology. So that's kind of the connection. I read his Hegel, especially the introduction, which I thought was interesting in terms of laying out the kind of climate, intellectual climate and atmosphere. But I think Sean went off and did that work on Hegel, which was so interesting because among Jungians, there was this sense that Hegel was persona non grata. I remember Mary Louise von Franz, who was one of the closest disciples of Jung, herself originally came out of a background in classical studies and classical languages and so on. At any rate, she became probably later in Jung's life his number one assistant. Anyway, she gave a lecture at Loyola campus, and a question was posed to her about Hegel because there seemed to be this correlation in some ways that people were sort of interested in. And she answered by saying, Jung loathed Hegel. And that was that shut the conversation down. So, and Jung said Hegel was un psychologue malgré lui, is how it described it. So, Sean managed to put together the connections, which I found very interesting, and his mentor, John Durley, who was at Carleton, who was fascinated and actually very much influenced Sean by Sean's connecting the two together, which I think is, part of the original work he's done, because otherwise most Jungians simply keep them apart. You don't want to violate the received tradition of where Hegel should be located.
Got it. Okay. I guess the other thing too is, because he obviously turned towards transpersonal psychology in a big way, and eventually got into Ken Wilber. And obviously, from the previous conversation we had, you're obviously very well conversant with Ken Wilber and his body of work and stuff like that. I'd be curious to hear a bit of your thoughts in terms of, the current state of transpersonal psychology, what the integral movement is, and its impact, I guess, on education more broadly, because it has a big impact, or has had a big impact, on a lot of people in terms of their educational philosophy. Goddard has his own philosophy of education, but in a certain way, having read your work in terms of conscious studies, it is integral in its overall orientation, very much like what people are talking about up at CIIS in terms of an integral education. So I'd be curious to hear a bit of your thoughts on that, and where you think that's all going a bit.
Well, I think that Wilber had this meteoric rise, and especially, in his early work, The Spectrum of Consciousness, which offered a different perspective. And then his, very prolific works that he put out one after the other, and was thought to be and recognized as, and I think legitimately so, probably the most important thinker coming into this whole field of transpersonal psychology, which grew out of, as you know, Maslow and a whole series of other things. But he crystallized this, and as is the case in the United States, becoming a celebrity and a star is important. And Wilber, managed to provide the, productions that legitimize this. But I think what happened and has happened is that this is kind of congealed in a way into a more measured view of Wilbur. So he's no longer perceived as the, kind of paragon of bringing all of these pieces together in his sort of elaborate, constructed sort of analysis and understanding. And then went off into this whole integral thing, which sort of removed him from having an impact, I think, especially in the academic field. And then we had critiques that started to emerge as well. I think one of the most important being Jorge Ferrer's work on revisioning transpersonal theory. Mm-hmm. But Sean himself co-edited a work which examined Wilbur and kind of with the back and forth in terms of, some of the critiques and some of the responses and some of, and this I don't think is unusual when an individual of talent and considerable achievement needs to be assessed and where they're kind of finally going to get located in this whole process. But that whole integral movement sort of developed into something of its own. And he had followers, and followers have loyalties. And you get this kind of thing that has sort of emerged. At Goddard, our own perspective is really not all that influenced by, Wilbur. There may be certain similarities in terms of the notion of integral and so on, which I think is sort of a term that has a reality outside of Wilbur's, conception about this. And you see this in Jorge Ferrer's work too, where he uses this term integral education, what have you. But I think the critique has sort of settled down Wilbur into being one of a number of individuals who then has gone off on his own and, developed a kind of a following. I've had students who have done masters on Wilbur, and my understanding at one time, I think Wilbur taught at Goddard for, I think, a semester or something way back when.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you had mentioned that in our conversation as well. Yeah.
Yeah. But, to me, I think Stanislav Grof is probably the individual who will have a lasting kind of importance in terms of bringing that rich background that he has in psychiatry and psychoactive studies. And I think the CIIS people tend to be more identified with, or at least sympathetic to kind of the Grof's approach, Richard Tarnas and other people along those lines. So Wilbur's, to some degree, seems to have sort of moved himself out of that sort of mainstream, even though he has recognition and, some of the others, Walsh and so on, who still value and did when in early Wilbur, I guess. So that's kind of my rough sort of take on.
Yeah. Well, because like exactly like you said, though, because the integral motif is, obviously Wilbur was deeply inspired by Sri Aurobindo, so he was drawing on the East as well in terms of that whole sort of lineage and tradition that was very much or has influenced CIIS.
Oh yeah.
Sure. But like you said, though, there are some Western roots to this as well. Like Gene Gebser is one in terms of obviously that's impacted Wilbur quite a bit. And because I actually have a conversation, I'm going to be meeting up with one of my old professors, Marc Lalonde. And when I tried to talk to him about Ken Wilbur, he thought I was talking to him about Jacques Maritain and Jacques Maritain's integral humanism.
Right.
And I'm still kind of reeling from that, and obviously having read his work now and stuff like that, and I'm always wondering why some of these other sort of figures that we're thinking integrally, if we can say it like that, even somebody like Jung, right? Gene Gebser, and somebody like Jacques Maritain, and in my conversations with Marc Lalonde, in terms of obviously because he was a direct student of Charles Davis, and Charles Davis was, deeply inspired by all these sort of schools and philosophies of thought. So I'm wondering maybe if there's like a Canadian version of this somehow versus an American version of this in terms of thinking along these lines. Uh, throughout the years. I mean, because Coward talks about, like, I mean, the 50 plus years of religious studies in Canada has solidified almost into a form of civil religion almost, or a culture, around these institutions and stuff like that. And I'm wondering maybe, if this is something maybe that's coming on the horizon, and I'd be curious to hear maybe just a few of your thoughts on that as well.
I don't know that I have all that much to say about it because, in some respects, my own, experience in education has been tied to not only Goddard, but what has been going on in the US. The majority of my students were American students. There were
Mm,
some before 9/11 that came from India and other places. I did have a few Canadian students. There are some Canadian faculty there. But you know, my experience really was more in the American scene, and I can't say all that much around what's going on in Canada other than some of the brief comments I've made, and certainly around what you're asking. Um, and I'd also say that the center of gravity of discussions and influences seems to be so much more driven by what occurs down in the US in
yeah.
such, you know, groups such as the American Academy of Religion. I went to a conference, for example. There was a conference in Montreal going back, I don't know, a decade or so, and people came from all over, and it was wonderful. And they went to the conference center and so on. And then I was at one in San Francisco, and I was part of a panel because I wrote an essay on Ram Dass, and I initially presented it there, and then it was later published. But it was, 2, 3 times the size. This was, driven by the interest that surfaced among, the community of, educators and students and what have you. And I think that's where you can decipher certain developments that seem to have kind of or do sweep over, what goes on in Canada. And I would say that the restrictions and limitations due to funding and certain administrative decisions around what constitutes religious studies, whereby you see in so many different departments. I can tell you, University of Ottawa got absorbed with other departments. They no longer have that kind of independent sort of status as a religious studies department. They're kind of coexistent with, partnered with, and subsumed into other departments. Carleton was the same thing. Even the religious studies at McGill underwent, a shift and a change. And the heyday of religious studies, seems to me, was in an earlier period of time. And that was the case in the United States, too, where you saw these sort of creative centers such as University of Chicago and places like that, or even the Center for the Study of World Religion at Harvard. And I don't know whether there's going to be a rebirth here or not, but there seems to be something of a lull. And then the other side of this, too, is that some of the interesting developments that would constitute, what we could generally expand into thinking about the religious or spiritual take place outside of religious studies department. One of the other conferences that I'm interested in and have been to is the Towards the Science of Consciousness conference, held biannually at the University of Arizona, but there are other centers too and smaller conferences of one sort or another. And here there are people drawn from many different disciplines, the neurosciences, philosophy, some from religious studies, etc. And it's very rich, it's very interdisciplinary, and it is so much broader and so much more unconstrained by, certain conventions and certain perspectives. So I was at a conference, actually Goddard sponsored, was one of the sponsors in 2008 in New Delhi, and there were 400 people there from all over the world with all kinds of backgrounds, and it was on psychology and spirituality. And it was really fascinating. And I think that that's also part of a certain trend that people are not so identified with particular religious traditions or orientations in that kind of theological, etc. sense.
Yeah.
And that that shifts things. Whether that's going to have an impact on religious studies, I don't know. In places like CIIS or even at Goddard, we bring things in that are part and parcel of this richness as best as we could, and encourage students to work on this stuff. And yeah. I was talking to a former student yesterday who lives in Florida, and he's applied to do a doctorate at CIIS, and he was actually accepted. And so we had a conversation about what he was going to do. And he's broadly interested in aesthetics, Japanese martial arts, pottery, and Buddhism, so there's a whole kind of richness there, bringing in other elements that could perhaps not live so easily together in a Department of Religious Studies or a Faculty of Religious Studies or something along those lines.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah. And I mean, there's a few interesting cognitive scientists as well in Canada. I mean, Evan Thompson and is one out in BC that's had a big impact on me as well. He's very interesting, and I mean, they're straddling all kinds of these questions from a very interdisciplinary type framework. Right. I mean, cognitive science today is, it is so interdisciplinary. So it's going to be very interesting to go and see how that comes about. So, I mean, there's just so much exciting stuff that's out there. And I mean, the conversation that I had with Sean McGrath as well, I'm super excited of what he's doing along with Garth Green up at the Faculty of Religious Studies, since they're thinking of, try to create a society essentially around the philosophy of religion in Canada. And I'm hoping that, that'll create a bit of a gravitational pull for people to start to have these types of questions, but also to remember this history. That's really something that's come to get me after the last little while. I mean, reading Coward's work is this, that, there's just this rich history.
Yeah. But if you want this history to have a future life, you have to have opportunities for people. Just to digress for a second, I was talking to Bob Stevenson. It was the kind of background, it's Hinduism at McGill, and Charles Adams, and I was sitting down, I was with them, and they were talking about future positions, and they were working out some stuff for the American Academy of Religion. And Adams and I were walking across the campus. He was heading to the Islamic Institute, which his office was actually in the Leacock building. And he said, Francis, there's going to be all kinds of jobs and this and that and the next thing. Well, that's, great. It's something to look forward to. Well, there weren't all kinds of jobs. I applied for many, many, many jobs and did not get any. And I can say that, I had courses here and there, one thing or another. And I think that was the experience of a number of us. And if you're going to draw people into religious studies as a discipline, an area, then they have to have a means by which to support and sustain themselves. And in many respects, that also means taking up a position in the academy somewhere. But if there are no jobs and no this, no that, then what do you do? One of the reasons I would have been very happy to have taught up here in Canada and so on, and there were no opportunities. Not like I had at Goddard, who handed me,
a carte blanche.
Well, and they just wanted me to develop this, consciousness studies concentration. Here it is. It's yours. How are you going to put it together? And that's, what my work ended up being. And I had no such opportunity up here.
Well, I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, two of my favorite scholars right now from Canada is Galen Watts and Matt McManus. And I mean, they're recent graduates from, I think, Carleton in York. Well, Matt is from York. And I mean, he's published 7 books since graduating, and he can't get a job in Canada. I mean, and his work is amazing. It's one of the most inspiring works I've ever seen. I mean, I recently just had him on my podcast, and, it it really breaks my heart to go out and see that, that we have this homegrown talent that our education system is going out and producing. And then all of a sudden, I mean, they can't go out and find the work that they need to go out and support themselves, to go out and start not only their careers, but start to have a family. And then, they get drawn into the United States. I mean, Galen's actually abroad in Europe, and Matt just landed a job up at the University of Michigan.
Yeah.
And I just think it's a real shame that we're just not doing a very good job to go out and retain our talent and, keep some of this alive. But I mean, again, I just want to thank you not only for your time, but I mean, all the suggestions in terms of readings that you've given me. I mean, I've been reeling and enjoying them tremendously. And it's come to inform a lot of the conversations that I'm having and stuff like that around the podcast, and I hope to keep on doing as well. Mm-hmm. So, and I would love to circle back around again to actually dive in a bit deeper in terms of your work on Jung. Especially since of the conversations I had with Sean McGrath and his friend out in Europe around the Secular Christ series that they're doing, that they talk a lot about Jung. I would love to get your perspective on that eventually as well, and either have tea or coffee again. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, well, let's do that, because it's nice just to get together too and sit down and And now that I'm retired, I have more time, and it keeps me stimulated as well. But otherwise, I might start forgetting all kinds of things. Yeah.
Well, you don't seem to have lost a beat at all. So so to be continued. And again, thank you for your time.